Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. This is always the worst part of my week, when I have to ask the same exact question I always ask, and you give another terrible answer. I'm like Charlie Brown in the spirit of What's to Follow. I'm like Charlie Brown kicking a football, and you are Lucy pulling it away.
I have a good story this week.
Oh, you don't.
This week brings some disturbing news about and for cicadas. It turns out that some cicadas have contracted a fungus called Massospora. The cicadas contract it while mating, making Massospora basically an insect STD. Compared to human STDs, this one is horrific. Among humans, one typically gets socially unacceptable itching. Among cicadas, their butts fall off.
I know a lot of people in the United States right now want to bottle that and get it on the market.
There's no need to go into the how and why of what's going on here, and if you want to look it up, please, for God's sake, keep the details to yourself. What's important here is the take-home, that we're about to be inundated by a bunch of buttless bugs. As to how the cicadas feel about the whole business, my guess is that they probably don't mind. You see, the Massospora fungus, in addition to deleting cicada butts, is the Walter White of the fungus world. When it infects a cicada, the first thing it does is to set up a meth lab inside the cicada where it begins producing amphetamines and psilocybin, the same chemical found in magic mushrooms.
This sounds like a pretty good beginning to a story here. And I read something on cicadas just this week. Some knucklehead was saying, okay, here are the many ways that you can eat them.
Oh, yes, I've seen this.
I thought, okay, that's pretty disgusting. But if cicadas turn into jumping magic mushrooms, I say bring on the ranch and let's start dipping those things in something that tastes good, and let's eat them all.
Here we have this soon-to-be buttless cicada with a meth lab built in, producing amphetamines and psilocybin. And for perspective, psilocybin in humans causes a distorted sense of time and reality, hallucinations, and a profound sense of oneness with the cosmos.
Well, sometimes.
That's what I understand.
I have read about this somewhere or another.
People say that that's what happens.
Yeah, that's right.
So Massospora becomes the cicada's own in-house pusher, getting the insect hooked on copious quantities of the drugs before delivering the bad news that the bill amounts to one butt. Of course, by this time, the cicada would happily trade anything so long as Massospora keeps that sweet, sweet cocktail flowing. And if we could ask the cicadas if, given their lack of nethers, they'd do it again, my guess is they'd say, you bet your ass.
Oh, that's that's rich. God, I don't know what's more pathetic, you not trying to be funny or you trying to be funny, because it's a downside either way. Either way. God almighty. In other news, we go halfway around the world to think about what's going on in Israel with the problems that have been bubbling up to the surface for quite some time. Things have been very, very difficult. We've been asked any number of times to weigh in on this stuff, and we opted not to. Half because we don't know enough to do it justice. And the other half, the problem there is very likely insoluble. There's nothing you can say that would be acceptable all the way around. It is an insoluble problem, and yet something weird happened over there just this past week. Rhonda Awais, a 58-year-old, waited 9 years for a kidney, and she received one from a Jewish man. She's a Christian Arab, and she receives a kidney from a Jewish man. His name was Yigal Yeshua, who was killed in the present unrest. Think about that. In a fight between Arabs and Jews in which people die, one man died, and his legacy was to give a kidney, not to a Jew, but to an Arab.
Yeah.
And yet you have to sit back and realize all the things that make us the same, all the things that unite us, instead of the very few things that divide us. I don't suspect this is ever going to become that exemplar that leads to peace in the Middle East, but it points to something far greater than itself.
Yeah.
And now for something completely different. Here we have yet again one Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, who ran unopposed in her district, the 14th in Georgia. And I just want to call out that district a little bit. This is your fault. You knuckleheads couldn't even convince somebody to run against this woman. But this past week, this gem dripped off her lips. She decided that she was going to compare masks that people might be forced to wear to the gold Jewish star that Jews were forced to wear as the Nazis plundered Europe. This knucklehead thinks that these two things are somehow equivalent. What in God's name is wrong with her? I'm a little angry at the Republican Party, just generally at this point, because the House of Representatives could have refused to sit her.
That's right, they could have.
They could have taken one look at her and said, okay, everybody's in, but not you. And if the Republicans did that, what are the odds the Democrats would have said, no, we can't do that?
Right.
They would have been only too happy to follow right along. So this was avoidable at the point of the election in which she ran unopposed, and at the point of sitting in Congress, which surely could have gone the other way if just a couple hundred people had their brains out and thinking. And yet, here we are. We're never going to be able to get her to be quiet. She also, in the same breath, referred to Nancy Pelosi as mentally ill. I don't feel any great need to rescue Nancy Pelosi from the ravings of a lunatic. I think she might deserve that.
If you enjoy Words and Numbers, and we know you do, get over to Amazon and purchase our book, Cooperation and Coercion. It's like being able to take Aunt and James home with you, without all the weirdness. If you have already done the right thing and purchased our book, please return to Amazon and leave us the stellar review you have been itching to write.
You're getting a little forceful with these things. I remember back just a year ago when you said, well, if you like us, maybe you could give us a review. I don't know.
Christmas is coming. We got to get the sales up. Blake Scott Ball is Assistant Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Huntington College in Alabama, and is a graduate of the University of Alabama, where he earned a PhD in history. Blake is the author of Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts, published by Oxford University Press. He joins us this week to talk about Charles Schulz and Peanuts. If you'd like to pick up a copy of his book, there is a link in the show notes along with a code for a generous discount. Blake, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you.
As I'm looking through your book, you say something that just struck me so hard. Charles Schulz and Peanuts, which until I'm reading your book, I'd never thought of it as a commentary on anything. But of course, I guess I grew up on it, so when I was little, it was just entertainment. But you said something fascinating, that so much in terms of comics are about divisiveness and it'll excite one group and annoy the other. But somehow Schulz brought people together, that people from left, right, center, whatever, found value in his work. And particularly in today's environment, my God, that's a tremendous gift. How did he pull this off?
That's a great question. Schulz was a master at introducing really tough issues that were close to home, oftentimes introducing them in the form of questions or open-ended comments, and then unleashing a whole flood of commentary and response and ideas from his fans from across the country who by 1970 numbered about 100 million daily readers. There's really not something, the equivalent in our pop culture today that is so broadly beloved, but yet at various times, as I talk about in my book, he's talking about all of the really controversial issues of the day, whether it's the Vietnam War or school integration or the sexual revolution and feminism and environmentalism, all types of issues that he's commenting on and addressing. I think some of it was in his ability to introduce a topic, but not feel that he had to be the final word, that he was starting a conversation. And then he participated in that with fans, both through the mail and in conventions and speaking engagements and things.
It's interesting because you get to that 100 million mark pretty quickly here. And that's astonishing that anybody could reach that number of people. But it probably masks what's more astonishing, and that's that he seemed to put out a new comic strip literally every day.
Yes.
How did he keep that pace up over so many years?
He was workmanlike in the way he approached cartooning. And he emphasized this in interviews when he would get these questions. He sat down like this was his 8 to 5, and he did this every day. He said, if I can walk away having had one good idea that day, it's a successful day, but it might have taken hours to get to that idea. To your point, yeah, starting in October 1950, all the way until he passed away in February of 2000, Peanuts ran every day every day for right at 50 years.
And if I'm remembering correctly, colored version over the weekends, right, in the Sunday papers.
That's right.
It wasn't even as if he took a weekend, maybe one day,
Right.
maybe one day,
Right.
which is really quite a lot of output, probably more than most people today could comprehend.
Yeah, we're talking over 17,000 different comic strips over his career.
My word.
Yeah.
Two things stick out to me, and that's Snoopy as a war figure. What was that all about? And then the introduction of Franklin later as the first black comic character.
Yeah.
And I know he took some flack over that, maybe from both sides of the political theater. But if you can get me up to speed on what I'm supposed to make of Snoopy as a wartime figure, because it always stuck out like a sore thumb. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And he worked through these periods of our history when war was very much on our minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really bizarre thing. And really one of the things that first got me thinking along these lines of Peanuts and political commentary was actually seeing Vietnam soldiers, especially airmen, that used the imagery of Snoopy the Flying Ace on their helmets, in their insignia. There were landing zones in Vietnam named after both Snoopy and Charlie Brown. Well, it's bizarre in a couple of ways. One being you just don't expect to find Snoopy and Charlie Brown in the jungles of South Vietnam, but also it reinforces the youth that was deployed in fighting the war in Vietnam. Snoopy's kind of the perfect character to do this because I don't know if anyone even knows this reference anymore, but they were referred to him as a Walter Mitty character. He's a daydreamer. He loves imagining all kinds of things. And so he begins imagining himself in 1965 as a World War I flying ace pursuing the Red Baron. And it starts off as classic film settings, but then it progressively gets darker and more visceral and more real in 67 and 68 to the point to where Snoopy continually gets shot down. He spends time as a POW at one point during his imaginary war. In many instances, it gets to the point to where the neighborhood that Charlie Brown lives in just kind of vanishes and is replaced with the war-torn countryside of France. It's a really shocking turn in Peanuts as Snoopy is engaged in his imaginary war that unmistakably is mirroring a lot of the events that are going on in Vietnam.
Could I follow up just very briefly?
Yeah.
This seems to dovetail with Ant's first point. When we see Snoopy, we see him in World War I.
Right.
And yet everybody knows that it's time to talk about Vietnam.
Yeah.
And the obvious thing to do would have been to go back to World War II. But he didn't do that.
Yep.
He went back to World War I, which was a war that the Americans didn't have all that much to do with until late in the day, and where we don't have stunning losses. That was a European war.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fascinating because no matter what your perspective on Vietnam, you're not going to be offended by anything in the World War I experience.
Right. That's a great point. By removing it from any of the lived experience of any of his audience, but also placing it with the most cartoonish of his characters, it allowed him the kind of inoffensive space to make the comments that he wanted to make. But there were some surprising times that I discussed when he brings it right into the real world of the kids. For example, there's a number of cases where Charlie Brown and Linus and Lucy have conversations about being drafted. Linus at one point says, "What happens when you get drafted?" Charlie Brown says, "Well, they send you someplace." And Linus looks real worried and he says, "Well, I don't look forward to being sent wherever they're sending people when I'm old enough." Or Lucy goes on a series of telling unfortunate truths that you might as well know. And she's telling all her friends these. And the one she tells to Charlie Brown is he's probably going to get drafted one day. In another case, Snoopy goes to talk to the Daisy Hill puppy farm where he had grown up. He goes to talk to the other puppies there and actually ends up in the middle of a Vietnam War riot. There's a protest that breaks out because, according to Linus, the newspapers say that they're upset about dogs that have been sent to Vietnam and aren't making it back home. At the same time that he is finding ways to be inoffensive, there's also times, and we could turn to Franklin here, there's also times where we see him using the cultural capital that he's earned, the kind of goodwill that he's earned with his audience to push those bounds a little more. In the case of Franklin, American pop culture was at a very interesting moment by the mid 60s, and one that we may be even seeing in some ways in our own time, where there had been this very clear reaction against older stereotypes of African American characters and a removal of those characters from pop culture. But there was a real timidness among cultural creators to take the step of replacing it with anything for fear of offending a mainstream audience, one way or the other. And so as they've tried to clean up the cultural representations of African Americans, they've in effect deleted African American characters from much of pop culture by the mid 1960s. The very few exceptions are cases like on television. Bill Cosby was on I Spy at that time in a co-starring role, and Sidney Poitier was in film, but those were two real exceptions to the general rule. Like most creators, Schulz is staying far afield away from Black characters, but he starts to get a series of really pointed fan letters. One set in particular from a lady in Southern California. She's a stay-at-home mom named Harriet Glickman, and she starts writing Schulz. She, it turns out, has written a number of different creators, and she is calling for him to integrate Peanuts. It needs a Black character to show the diversity of America. Schulz is very reluctant. He said, I think it's a great idea and I support it, but I don't think I'm the right person to do it. So she continues to push the issue, and she recruits some of her neighbors, some African-American parents, to also write letters and tell Schulz what it would mean to their families to have Black characters in this national strip. This is in 1968, so Martin Luther King had been assassinated in April, and then that summer, Robert Kennedy is assassinated in the midst of some of his calls for continuing efforts in the civil rights movement. Schulz decides, you know what, I may not be the perfect person to voice a Black character, but this platform does call for doing something meaningful on this issue. And so he introduces Franklin and introduces him at the beach with Charlie Brown. So the first time you see the two boys, they're both in their swim trunks. There's no doubt whatsoever the difference between the two, but they act like it's the most normal thing in the world. They become friends. They talk about their families. Franklin mentions that his father is away serving in Vietnam. Thereafter, Franklin moves to the neighborhood, and we start seeing their interactions. For the most part, you don't see any serious pushback on Franklin until Franklin one day shows up in one of the classroom scenes with Peppermint Patty. This was about 1970. When Franklin shows up in the classroom, you get a whole slew of Southern newspaper editors who start writing the syndicate saying, we can't run this in our newspapers. School integration is too much of an issue here. And we advise that either the artists stop doing these scenes or we won't be able to run Peanuts. There wasn't much pressure from the editor to change it, but Schulz's response was, if we lose some newspapers, then we lose some newspapers, but he believed it was the right thing to do.
As I recall, the character, I don't remember it ever being ham-fisted. I don't remember it ever being that Franklin is different. It was the best kind of integration, the natural kind when everybody looks around and doesn't see a problem.
Yep.
Am I remembering this correctly?
That's absolutely right. And in fact, there's only one time in the comic strip where it is even mentioned by a character that Franklin is Black. And it's this really curious strip in the 1970s where Peppermint Patty goes out onto the ice to practice her figure skating. And as she's doing a spin, she runs into Franklin, who is out on the ice practicing hockey. Peppermint Patty says, Franklin, you're in my way. You're ruining my practice. He says, well, I'm practicing for the pros one day. And the punchline of the strip is Peppermint Patty looking at Franklin and saying, Franklin, how many Black players are there in the NHL?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really blunt. And in fact, Schulz got at least one letter that I found about someone uncertain about what Schulz's point was. Was she making fun of Franklin? What was going on? And Schulz, who was a lifelong hockey fan, this man ran a hockey rink in Northern California in his community. He played hockey every Tuesday night into his 70s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Loved hockey. he wrote that in essence, what he's talking about was really an indictment of the sport he loved. That it was, as you saw, baseball and basketball and football and all of these other spaces, schools and things integrating and moving towards a more inclusive community. Here was still hockey without that same type of racial diversity. In that case, he just called it right on the nose.
Well ahead of his time, because I remember having the race and hockey discussion with my daughters in the 2010s.
Yeah.
We're still having that discussion now. And I'm still making the same remark that Charles made all those years ago. Where is everybody?
Yeah.
You can kind of see it with hockey breaking right before your eyes. All of a sudden, it's getting different. Mm-hmm. He was 40 years ahead of the curve here. This is astonishing because the little I know of him, I know some from your book, but prior to that, I really don't know much about Schulz the person. But it seems that he was dispositionally quite conservative.
Right.
He didn't set out to be a radical. He was just a conservative guy writing a comic strip.
He says some interesting things about his politics in a series of interviews in the 80s and then in the 90s, where in one case, the interviewer asked him, he said, "You seem generally conservative. How would you describe your politics?" And Schulz said, "Oh, I would describe myself as quite liberal." And the interviewer is shocked. And so, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "Well, what I mean by that is that society should be defined by the generosity and the effort and creativity and assistance of individuals. It is a good thing for individuals to be liberal with their means, with their abilities in helping their communities and helping one another." And then he launches into a whole conversation about California politics. In this particular conversation, this was Clinton era, 90s. And he says, "How is the government going to provide for all these things?" He points out in particular the Humane Society in his county in Northern California that was going out of business. They didn't have the funds, that he pretty much took over funding himself. He said, "Is the government going to come along and take care of puppies?" They clearly weren't. He has a very interesting conception of politics. He sees himself as a liberal individual in the way he handles his personal life. But he was very much a conservative in the way that he thought about the limits on government and the fiscal responsibility with which government should conduct itself.
And that's interesting because in your book, Charlie Brown's America, of course, the whole strip centers around Charlie Brown. And you say in the book that he describes Charlie Brown as wishy-washy. And of course, that's what comes across. Charlie Brown can never win. Lucy's always pulling the ball out from him over and over again. And yet you don't come away feeling that the character, or the strip for that matter, isn't communicating something.
Mm.
Somehow he manages not to be wishy-washy in his wishy-washiness. That seems to typify how you're describing Charles Schulz himself.
Yeah. That's a really funny thing about him. I think he finds himself, like a lot of Americans found themselves in these conversations, where you can't easily peg them on some political scientist's graduated spectrum. It is a range, and there's nuance to it, and there's shades to it, and it grows and changes over time as different issues approach. That was something that kind of drew me to studying Charles Schulz.
One of the things that I don't think I ever thought of until today, when you cast your mind back and you're thinking about these characters you grew up with, I'm thinking about the TV specials where you get to meet them more like in 3 dimensions than not. But the thing that hits home now that I'm so much older, is that each of the characters had a certain kind of dignity.
Yeah.
Things were not done at the expense of people that would really hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
There was just this certain understanding of the dignity of man as you look across all these characters. And it's, I think, probably most impressive across the gender divide, given the times that these kids would have been alive in the 1960s. We had all kinds of gender problems, and yet they didn't really manifest in the strip. So too, the introduction of Franklin, he's a dignified character and he's always treated as such. How does a dispositionally conservative man come to write a comic strip in the first place? And then once he does, how does he get so far out in front of all of the progressives of his own era?
Yeah. You don't see a creation like Peanuts coming out of Soviet Russia in the second half of the 20th century. There are too many problems with the question of utility for something like this to exist at the size that it does in a planned society. So I think that Peanuts and what Charles Schulz was doing is really one of the great expressions of human freedom and liberty, both from him and from his audience in responding by consuming the art that he was producing. He did this thing because he loved it. He often called himself a businessman. He very much looked at it as a business enterprise. He was looking to be successful with it. But unlike a number of other creators in the comics field, at a certain size, a lot of creators developed a team that would do a lot of the art for them, and they would just dictate ideas and enjoy the fruits of their success. Schulz always said, that's like going to the golf course and have somebody else tee it up and drive it for me, right? He did it because he had business goals, but he also did it out of just a personal passion. As far as how he got ahead of the commentary of his time, there was a lot of conversation in the early 70s, especially during the Watergate years, of a young artist then named Gary Trudeau in his Doonesbury comic strip. And there were a lot of comparisons, and people would ask Charles Schulz, how is this different? Is this the new Peanuts for our time and things like this? And while Schulz was complimentary of Trudeau and the innovations that he was making, Schulz would also say that the type of politics that Trudeau is doing is really easy. It's aim at whoever the head honcho is and take a kick, and there you go. Everybody loves to hate the boss. Schulz said that the type of politics I do are about life and about interpersonal relationship and about emotion and about things that are still going to be around when whatever controversial administration is long gone. You don't need Nixon in the space to understand the commentary of 1970s Peanuts. You don't need Bill Clinton or whoever else to understand this commentary. And so his politics in that way were politics of empathy, of really putting yourself in the shoes of someone else and trying to understand how they're experiencing these challenges we're going through.
I'm actually a big fan of Doonesbury, and yet when I sit and think about it, it's much more cynical.
Oh, yeah.
And with Peanuts, cynicism just doesn't enter the picture.
Well, I think it goes back to where we started, which is that Peanuts talks about politics, but Doonesbury talks about partisanship.
Right.
It's a very, very different animal.
Great point.
And I think you can love them both. I actually love them both.
Yeah,
Me too.
absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I love Schulz more that he didn't buckle to the pressure. He kept his own vision and, near as I can tell, never deviated from it. You'd know better than we would.
Yeah.
But it seems that he was true to his founding vision all the way through.
He really was.
Blake, we've run out of time, but if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could tell our listeners that one thing that you would like them to know about Charles Schulz if they know nothing else.
Man, hit me with a hard question right at the end.
Should have done it first.
If there's one takeaway that I hope people have from this book, I think that it is a kind of call to restoring conversation, that there is value in talking to one another, even when we hate what the other one has to say. There's value in talking to one another rather than talking in separate corners about one another. That is how the productive work in our society will get done. And I think that's how problems will get solved. And that was a philosophy, I think, that Schulz practiced throughout his career, that there were going to be plenty of folks who disagree with you, but that doesn't mean that you can't have the conversation to discover those surprising places where you might actually have some commonality. You might have some shared interests.
Blake, thank you for joining us. This was actually a good amount of fun for me to talk about something that was so near and dear to me in my childhood. I'm glad you wrote the book. It's high time someone did. And I hope that our listeners will click that link that we've left where you can purchase the book all for yourself.
Thank you guys so much.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we have somebody, I don't know, maybe almost as interesting as Blake. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes.
Send email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
I like this approach. This is the best approach. You just hurry up and get it over with.
wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Idiot. I just want to point out that I get a raft of spam every morning now, and it's all addressed to wordsandnumbers@gmail.com. Somehow you managed to get our throwaway email address on a boob list, and every charlatan in the world writes to me every morning.
I get ones that split it out. It'll be addressed to Mr. Numbers and say, Dear Words and.
Yep, I get those too. And come on, man, just come on. This is all your fault, and there's no contrition whatsoever on your part. Anyway, I'm going to offer a piece of advice that flies in the face of everything I've just done, but maybe you can be nice to each other. I can't be nice to him anymore, but maybe the rest of you can be nice to all of the other rest of you, and we'll see you next week. See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.